It wasn't every day that a Zanari queen strolled through a black market auction on the outer rim of the Loran galaxy, flanked by 20 armed sentinels and dressed in a shimmering exogown that could rewrite its own patterns based on her mood. Queen Zeltrana the Ninth of Vyarkulus wasn't known for mingling with organics, especially not Terrans. But here she was, towering at nearly 10 feet tall, mandibles twitching with interest as she inspected the scrawny, unimpressive human curled up in a gravity cage, arms crossed, clearly unimpressed. "Name?" she inquired, her translator hissing in 20 dialects before settling on a smooth, female voice. The auctioneer, a greasy-skinned Fenari who'd replaced his teeth with tiny plasma emitters, chuckled nervously. "This one? Calls himself Danny." Danny didn't move. If anything, he looked more irritated. "It's just Dan," he muttered. "He's not very obedient," the auctioneer added. "But extremely rare. Unaltered Homo sapien male. From Earth, pre-collapse. Survived 3 raids and a petting zoo incident." Queen Zeltrana's luminous eyes narrowed. "Unaltered? Primitive. I shall take him." The auctioneer blinked. "All due respect, Your Venomous Highness, but this model isn't combat-ready or house-trained. He's more likely to sass than serve. Maybe you'd prefer a newer synth slave?" "I said I shall take him," Zeltrana repeated coldly, her gown flashing a sharp crimson pulse. Her guards aimed their bio-scorchers. Dan gave a long sigh. "Fantastic. Abducted by aliens, sold at a sketchy space flea market, and now owned by a 10-foot praying mantis in a disco robe." That was the beginning. The Queen's Palace ship, the Obsidian Oath, was less of a vessel and more of a flying continent. As he was escorted through a maze of living crystal walls, Dan tried very hard not to look impressed. Even though the elevator had just whispered to him in perfect English and offered him coffee. From its walls. His room was a lush suite with simulated sunlight, breathable air, somehow earth-fresh, and a botanical garden that sang lullabies when he got close. So, not the worst imprisonment. Dan sat on a velvet bench and looked around. "All right, what's the catch?" Zeltrana entered without warning, wearing a gown that now shimmered a curious teal. Her eyes observed him clinically. "I require a conversational subject," she said. "My advisors suggest that Terrans are unpredictable. Irritating. Amusing." Dan blinked. "Wait, you bought me to talk?" "You are not being asked, human." "Wasn't planning on obeying anyway." Zeltrana's mandibles twitched. "Interesting." Over the next few days, their interactions followed a pattern. She'd appear in the garden or his chambers, pose bizarre questions: "Is mayonnaise a battle fluid?" or "Why does your species consume lactose beyond maturity?" And Dan would respond with dry sarcasm or equally bizarre counter-questions. Once, he convinced her that karaoke was a vital Terran war ritual and had her screeching into a holographic microphone to a 20th-century pop song. The Sentinels still hadn't recovered. But beneath the banter, something started to shift. Dan realized she wasn't just gathering intel or mocking him. She was curious. Lonely, even. Ruling an empire of 200 subjugated planets apparently left little time for genuine conversation. Her court was full of sycophants and fear. Dan, by contrast, had zero interest in impressing her. Or surviving, for that matter. He'd lost everything when Earth fell. But when she mentioned the fall of Terra in passing, offhand, like talking about bad weather, he snapped. "You don't get to casually mention that like it was an inconvenience. That was my home. That was people." Zeltrana didn't reply immediately. Her gown flickered. "It was not I who gave the order. That was Queen Veclara, 3 reigns prior. I was a larva." Dan scoffed, turning away. Same empire. Same result. That silence stretched long. When he looked back, she wasn't there. She left without a word. It should have been the end of their interactions. But the next day, he woke up to find a cup of coffee, real, brewed, earth-grown beans, waiting on the table. And a note, handwritten in galactic common, "Let's talk again." I may have erred. Dan stared at it for a long time. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer just about ownership. Dan didn't expect the coffee to taste exactly like home. The bitterness, the warmth, the way it clung to the back of his throat, it was too real. Too intentional. Someone had worked hard to get it right. And the only someone that made sense was Queen Zeltrana. He stared at the mug longer than he drank from it. Not because it scared him, but because it confused him. A 10-foot mantis alien ruler of a star-spanning empire shouldn't care what a slave thought. She definitely shouldn't be apologizing. And yet, the next day, she came back. This time she didn't bring guards. She stood alone under the bioluminescent vines of the simulated garden, her gown pulsing a deep blue, the color Dan had come to associate with hesitation. "I studied your Earth rituals," she began. "An offering of nourishment is the first gesture of conciliation." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Well, congrats. You nailed it. But why bother?" She stepped forward. "Because you were right. I speak of your home's destruction as a footnote in a history lecture. But for you, it was everything. I failed to understand that." Dan blinked. For a second, just a second, she almost sounded human. "You ever lose anything, Queen Bug Lady?" he asked. Her mandibles twitched, but she didn't react to the nickname. "Yes. My clutch sister was devoured during a succession trial." She sang as the acids took her. Dan coughed, mid-sip. "Holy hell. We do not grieve as humans do. But we remember. And we change. That is why I'm speaking to you." She explained then, slowly and without the arrogance of a monarch, that her empire was teetering. The old ways, conquest, domination, fear, weren't sustainable anymore. Worlds were rebelling. Civil unrest grew. Her advisors blamed weakness. But she saw something else. You survived everything. Not because of power. Because of defiance. Humor. Adaptability, she said. I want to understand it. Use it. Dan snorted. You want to weaponize sarcasm? I want to survive, she said simply. So they struck a deal. Dan would remain on board not as a slave, but as an informal cultural advisor. In return, he got access to the ship's archives, food replicators, and, most importantly, autonomy. Kind of. He still had guards, but they kept their distance now. One even started playing cards with him. The problem, though, was the court. Her inner council, 8 powerful ministers from various subjugated species, were not happy. To them, Dan was a parasite. A soft-skinned ape with a smart mouth and no lineage, no military record, no worth. Minister Vroth, a thick-shelled brute from the Garshek colonies, confronted the queen during a meeting. He is contaminating you, Vroth hissed. You laugh now. You hesitate. Your gown flickers like a larva's. And you let him sit in council chamber as if he is your equal. Dan, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the dais, lazily ate a replicated sandwich and raised his hand. For the record, I asked to sit in the back. You guys don't have chairs. You mock us. I mock everyone. It's a coping mechanism. You should try it. Might loosen the carapace. The room erupted in clicks and screeches. Zeltrana remained still. I decide who contaminates me, she said. And sometimes, rot reveals the weakest parts of the hive. Dan smirked. I think that's the alien version of burn. That night, someone tried to kill him. His food replicator exploded, showering his chamber in burning plasma gel. Only the last-minute glitch of a hovering cleaning drone diverted the blast. Dan escaped with singed eyebrows and a growing suspicion that his advisory gig had officially crossed into political liability. Zeltrana visited him in the med bay. I will find who did this, she said. Dan looked at her. Welcome to human politics. Step 1, someone always wants you dead. She didn't flinch. Step 2? Figure out what scares them, and make it your armor. She stared at him, thoughtful. Would you teach me that? Dan smiled grimly. Yeah. But you're not gonna like the syllabus. Because now it wasn't just about survival. It was about strategy. Dan wasn't just a curiosity anymore. He was becoming dangerous. Ask ChatGPT. Dan had negotiated his way out of bar fights, police stations, and one very complicated breakup involving a stolen iguana. But nothing in his chaotic Earthborn past had prepared him for a diplomatic mission on Gorvaxis Prime, a planet best described as lava, attitude, and bugs the size of mopeds. Governor Threekle was an ex-military warlord with a face like a melted boot and a temperament to match. He ruled Gorvaxis with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, crushing resistance movements, hoarding resources, and executing traitors for infractions as minor as public sneezing. Dan had 3 days to convince this lava-stained despot to sign a peace accord with Zeltrana's new Council of Reforms. No pressure. He stepped off the transport ship into the heat-soaked air, flanked by 2 of Zeltrana's trusted guards and a drone broadcasting the event live to a dozen worlds. He was dressed in his usual "I don't care if this offends you" attitude, though now paired with ceremonial robes and a translator earpiece tuned to minimal sarcasm mode. Barely. Threekle met him on the blackened stone landing pad, arms folded, mandibles clicking in irritation. "You're the Queen's pet monkey." Dan smiled. "Human, technically. Monkey adjacent. And yeah, I'm her cultural advisor. Cultural weakness consultant, more like. Funny. That's what my high school counselor said." Threekle didn't laugh. Inside the fortress, Dan was brought to a war room. Literally. Every wall was lined with weapons, body counts, and holograms of conquered territories. He was offered a chair made of bones. Politely declined. Threekle loomed. "You have 3 days. Why wait? Die now and save us both the headache." Dan shrugged. "Because if I die, you miss your one chance to stop a rebellion before it spreads here." The governor laughed, a harsh rasp. "Rebellion? Here? My people worship fear." "That's the thing about fear," Dan replied, pacing now. "Eventually, it gets boring. And when that happens, they stop fearing. They start hoping. And that's a disease you can't quarantine once it spreads." Threekle's mandibles twitched. "And what would you replace fear with?" "Purpose. Progress. Karaoke, if it comes to that." Dan pulled out a holodisc and activated a recording. It was from a mining colony that had signed on to Zeltrana's reforms, a place once known for daily executions now full of children learning music, workers running free markets, and guards retiring without needing to be stabbed in the back. "They sing now," Dan said softly. "They build things that last. You could be part of that." Threekle's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his compound eyes. "This is propaganda." "Nope," Dan said, stepping closer. "It's what happens when you give people something to live for besides obeying." Silence fell. Day 2 went worse. Threekle hosted Dan at a blood sport arena. Dan was told to choose a weapon and fight a 6-legged behemoth bred for gladiatorial combat. He chose sarcasm and a collapsible chair. The chair broke instantly. He ran. A lot. Barely survived. But while dodging death, he made the crowd laugh. Somehow. Jokes about taxes, lava insurance, bad public transit. The people laughed. The beast got bored. Threekle watched in silence. Later, in the governor's private quarters, Threekle confronted him. "My people laughed at your jokes. Do you think that's victory?" "I think it's the first crack in a concrete wall," Dan said, bruised but defiant. Day 3 arrived. The peace treaty was placed on the war table. Dan waited, sweat clinging to his back. Threekle stared at it. Then, he signed it. "No promises this will hold," he growled. "But I'll give your queen a chance." Back on the Obsidian Oath, Dan stumbled into Zeltrana's throne room, burnt, limping, and grinning. "You survived," she said. "Define survived," Dan replied. "But yeah," he signed. She studied him with new intensity. Her gown shimmered gold, pride. "I miscalculated your value," she said. "You're not just adaptable. You're catalytic." Dan collapsed into a chair. "Tell that to the lava worm that tried to eat me." He didn't see the court watching from the shadows. He didn't hear the murmurs ripple across the ship's neural network. But he felt it. This wasn't the end of the challenge. It was the beginning of a rebellion. And somehow, he was its leader. "You said." The war didn't start with lasers or orbital strikes. It began with laughter, quiet, uncontrollable, dangerous laughter, from within the Queen's own palace. By the time Dan realized how far the ripples had spread, the movement had already outgrown him. Courtiers mimicked his speech patterns. Military commanders were quoting his one-liners in strategic briefings. Even the AI in the lavatory stalls had been updated with Earth sarcasm. The once cold halls of the Obsidian Oath now buzzed with subversive energy. That's when Minister Vroth and 4 allied counselors made their move. In the middle of a royal address, during which Dan was scheduled to present a Terran concept called Organized Civil Debate, a flashbang detonated above the throne. Chaos erupted. Security bots turned on their own. Screams echoed through the crystalline chamber. And from the smoke emerged Vroth, clad in obsidian armor, holding a plasma axe. "This is your evolution?" he roared, pointing at Dan. "A clown? A weak, flesh-sack comedian who teaches us to question. You poisoned her mind." Dan, stunned but not unarmed, grabbed a fallen guard's neural whip and flicked it on with a crackle. "You really need to learn the difference between poison and medicine." Zeltrana stood slowly from her throne, her gown darkening to a stormy black. "Vroth, you challenge the hive itself." "I challenge your rule," he growled. "And the Terran infection that corrupted it." In ancient Zanari tradition, a high-level betrayal could only be resolved one way, through a right of sovereignty. A duel, not of strength, but of influence. A battle to sway the loyalty of the hive. And for the first time in Vyarkala's history, a human was allowed to participate. The duel was unconventional. As all of Dan's plans were. Instead of weaponry, he requested a stage. Instead of armor, he wore a t-shirt that read "I'm with evolution" with an arrow pointing sideways. Half the court didn't get the joke. The other half wore the same shirt the next day. The rules were simple: each side would present their vision for the future, one based in fear and rigid hierarchy, the other in adaptability, humor, and cooperative strength. The hive would listen, and the Queen's neural network would calculate shifts in loyalty through emotional resonance feedback. In other words, win their hearts. Vroth went first. He boomed about strength, tradition, dominance. He evoked fear, honor, and bloodline purity. It was terrifying. Powerful. Then Dan stepped up, tapped the mic, and said, "All right. Let's talk about toilets." Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dan continued, deadpan. "Back on Earth, we had this idea. Clean water. Private space. No judgment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was human. And it worked. Every person, rich or poor, ruler or farmer, had a right to sit on a porcelain throne and reflect on their life in peace." A few nervous chuckles. "Now, tell me, what kind of empire gives its citizens plasma rifles but not the right to poop in peace?" Laughter exploded. Even the drone recording the event beeped in approval. Dan's speech shifted, slowly, from comedy to clarity. He spoke of Earth's mistakes, its collapses, but also its revolutions. He spoke of courage, not the kind that required blood, but the kind that demanded vulnerability, connection, the willingness to evolve. To laugh at yourself. He closed with, "You want to be feared. I want to be remembered. History only listens to one of us." When the neural pulse readout finalized, the results were undeniable. Vroth lost. Not just the duel, but the future. He was exiled to a distant moon colony where, rumor had it, his guards forced him to watch human sitcoms dubbed in Zanari. A fate worse than death, apparently. Zeltrana approached Dan afterward, silent for a long time. "You have reshaped the hive," she said. He shrugged. "I just told some jokes." "No. You taught us how to feel without fear. You taught me." Dan smirked. "So, am I still your slave?" She extended a long, clawed hand. "No. You are my equal." He hesitated, then shook it. "And your karaoke partner." The crowd cheered. Somewhere between sarcasm and sovereignty, humanity had won. Not with fire, but with laughter.